The gun was already in Sallie Reed's hand before the saloon doors had finished swinging behind her. The noise inside the silver spur stopped the way a clock stops when someone throws it against a wall. Cards froze mid-deal. Whiskey glasses paused halfway to lips. Piano keys went silent. Every pair of eyes in that smoky, amber-lit room turned toward the woman standing in the doorway, her black morning dress still dusty from 3 days of hard riding, her dark hair pinned back with a single ivory comb that had belonged to her mother, and her jaw set like a woman who had already made her peace with whatever came next. "I am looking for Harlan Voss," she said. Her voice did not shake. She had practiced making sure it would not shake. "I know he runs his games out of this saloon on Thursday evenings. Today is Thursday, so he is here. And whoever tells me which chair he is sitting in walks out of tonight with their dignity intact." Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The betrayal that had brought her to this moment was 3 months old now, but it burned in her chest as fresh as the morning her father had pressed the deed to their farm into her hands with trembling fingers and said, "I am sorry, Sallie girl. I am so sorry. I did not know he was lying." That had been 2 weeks before Thomas Reed, her husband of 4 years, had died of a fever that swept through the county like a cold, merciless hand, and she had buried him in the red earth behind the house, covered him with wildflowers, and then turned around to find that the farm she had just inherited did not legally belong to her family at all, because a man named Harlan Voss had filed false paperwork in the county seat. And her father's signature on a gambling debt had been the key he had used to pry open everything they had ever owned. The dark past she carried walked into that saloon with her. The forced choice she had made to ride from Abilene to the town of Dustcreek, Texas, in the summer of 1878 had cost her the last of the money she had hidden in the lining of her travel bag. She had no plan beyond this moment. She only had the gun, the name, and a grief so enormous it had burned away all her fear. "Miss," the voice came from her left, low, measured, not afraid of her, which was interesting because most men had gone pale. She turned her head without lowering the weapon. The man leaning against the bar was tall in the way that some men are tall, not as a statement, but simply as a fact of their construction. He had dark brown hair, pushed back from his forehead under a hat he had not removed. His coat was the deep green of a card player, but his hands, she noticed immediately, were not a card player's hands. They were calloused in ways that spoke of ropes and fence posts and honest labor. His eyes were the color of creek water over limestone, pale gray with something quietly alive in them, and they were fixed on her with an expression she could not immediately classify. It was not pity. It was not amusement. It was something closer to recognition, as though he had seen a person standing at the precise edge of an irreversible decision before, and perhaps had stood there himself. "Harlan Voss is not in this saloon tonight," the man said. "He rode out to Laredo on Tuesday, but if you lower that pistol I can tell you something better than where he is. I can tell you what he is planning to do next, and that is the information that will actually help you." Sallie Reed did not lower the gun. "And who are you," she said, "to know what Harlan Voss is planning?" The man straightened away from the bar. He moved slowly and deliberately, the way a man moves when he wants to prove he is not a threat, and he set his glass down on the polished wood with a soft, final sound. "My name is Clyde Whitaker," he said. "And about 6 months ago, Harlan Voss did to my family what I suspect he has done to yours." The saloon was still very quiet. Somewhere in the back, a chair scraped. Sallie kept her eyes on Clyde Whitaker's face, reading it the way her father had taught her to read the land, looking for signs of deception, for the hidden motives that lived in the spaces between words. She found none. What she found instead, and what unsettled her more than she would have admitted in that moment, was honesty. Plain, unadorned, and apparently indifferent to her weapon, she lowered the gun, not because she trusted him, because something in the calculation told her that if he had wanted to betray her, he would not have spoken at all. He would have let her walk further into the trap. "Talk," she said, and that was how it began. 3 months earlier, Sallie Reed had been a woman with a manageable grief and a modest future. She was 27 years old, widowed by fever in the spring of 1878, childless, and in possession of a small but functional farm outside Abilene, Kansas, that her father, Henry Caldwell, had built up over 20 years of drought-resistant stubbornness. She had married Thomas Reed at the age of 23 after 2 years of a courtship conducted mostly through letters, because Thomas had been working cattle drives and she had been helping her father plant sorghum, and neither of them had a great deal of leisure time. They had been content together. Not the sweeping, consuming sort of love that the traveling stage plays like to dramatize, but a warm, steady partnership that she had come to value more than she could have predicted. Thomas had been a good man. His death had left a hole in the daily rhythm of her life that she had been quietly learning to navigate around. It was her father's shame that had undone her, not her own. Henry Caldwell was 61 years old, and he had a weakness for cards that he had spent a lifetime trying to manage with varying degrees of success. In February of 1878, 3 weeks before Thomas fell ill, Henry had sat down at a poker table in the back room of a Wichita establishment, and across the table from him had been Harlan Voss, a broad, well-dressed man with a slow smile and the manner of someone who had never once wanted for anything in his life. The game had lasted 4 hours. Henry had lost steadily, then desperately, then completely. By the end of the night he had signed a promissory note, and then, under the influence of whiskey and the particular kind of panic that visits a man who knows he has gone too far, he had signed something else. A document that Voss had produced from an inner pocket, already prepared, that concerned a land assessment dispute Henry had not known existed, and a clause about a debt that Voss claimed was attached to the original land grant Henry had purchased in 1859. The document was false. The debt was invented. The assessment dispute was a fiction. But Henry's signature on it was real. And Harlan Voss was a man who knew how to work the county records system like a musician working a familiar instrument. By April, with Thomas 2 weeks in the ground and Sallie still wearing the gray cloud of her mourning around her shoulders, the sheriff's deputy from the county seat had arrived at the farm with papers establishing that the land had a prior encumbrance, and that the current holder of that encumbrance, one Harlan Voss, had exercised his legal right to claim it. The farm that Henry Caldwell had built with his hands over 2 decades was to be vacated within 60 days. Henry had tried to explain. He had gone to a lawyer in Abilene, but the lawyer had looked at the paperwork and shaken his head slowly and said, "Mr. Caldwell, whoever prepared this had it notarized properly, and the signatures are in order, and fighting it will cost more than the land is worth in legal fees alone." Henry had come home and told Sallie what had happened, and she had watched her father age 10 years in the span of that conversation. He was still alive, staying now with a cousin in Wichita, diminished and full of a guilt that expressed itself in silence. Sallie had packed a bag. She had found out that Harlan Voss operated out of Dustcreek, Texas, 240 miles south. She had ridden 3 days on a horse she had borrowed from her neighbor Mrs. Avery, who had not asked questions because Mrs. Avery was the kind of woman who understood that sometimes questions are a form of cruelty. She had arrived in Dustcreek on a Thursday evening, walked into the Silver Spur Saloon with her dead husband's revolver, and found not Harlan Voss but Clyde Whitaker. They sat at a corner table, far enough from the bar that the conversation was private, close enough to the door that neither of them felt trapped. The saloon had returned to its normal noise around them, though Sallie was aware that several men kept cutting glances toward their table, curious about the woman in morning black who had walked in pointing iron. Clyde Whitaker ordered coffee for both of them without asking, which in another context might have annoyed her. In this context, it was the right call, because she needed her hands to be warm and her head to be clear, and he seemed to understand that without being told. "Voss operates a scheme," Clyde said. He had turned his hat in his hands once before setting it on the table between them, and now he spoke with the quiet precision of a man who had spent time thinking hard about what he was going to say. He travels a circuit: Wichita, Dodge City, Amarillo, Laredo, back again. He finds men in gambling establishments who have something worth taking: farms or business deeds or water rights. He introduces a debt. He has a partner who works in the county record's office in 3 different jurisdictions, and that partner files the supporting paperwork while Voss is still sitting across the table from the mark. By the time the man sobers up, it is already in the system. Sallie wrapped both hands around the coffee cup. "My father," she said. Clyde nodded. "How long ago did it happen?" "February. The notice came in April." She paused. "My father did not know what he was signing. He thought it was a receipt for the debt, not an encumbrance document." "They never know," Clyde said, and there was something in the way he said it that was not condescending. It was tired. "My father lost our cattle operation in November of last year. He was 63 years old. He had built it for 30 years. He died in January." He said the last sentence without embellishment, and she felt the weight of it land in the space between them. "I am sorry," she said, and meant it. "He died ashamed," Clyde said. "That is the part I cannot forgive, not the land. He could have survived losing the land. It was the shame that killed him." Sallie understood that. She understood it with her whole body, in the way you understand things that have already happened to someone you love. "What are you doing here?" she asked. "In Dustcreek if Voss has gone to Laredo." "Waiting," Clyde said. "I have been tracking his circuit for 6 months. I know he comes back through here in 3 weeks. And I have been building a case." He reached into his coat and set a folded document on the table between them. "This is a sworn affidavit from a man named Prescott who used to work in the Comanche County Record's office. He was Voss's partner. He is willing to testify in exchange for a reduced sentence on an unrelated charge." Sallie looked at the document. Then she looked at Clyde Whitaker. "Why," she said, "have you not taken this to a judge already?" "Because one affidavit is not enough for a man with Voss's connections. The judge in this district has dined at Voss's table. I need corroboration. Multiple victims on record with sworn statements of their own." He paused. "You are the 7th person I have spoken to. But you are the first one with the courage to ride 240 miles in 3 days with a revolver and walk into a saloon." She felt something shift in the room, a warmth that was not from the coffee. She did not examine it. "Where are the other statements?" she said. "Safe in a lockbox at the bank in Amarillo," Clyde said. "The local banker, a man named Garfield, is sympathetic and honest, which is a rare combination." "And the plan is what exactly?" "To present the affidavits to a judge who is not in Voss's pocket. The federal circuit judge out of Fort Worth, Judge Albert Hines. He arrives in Dustcreek in 3 weeks, the same week Voss returns. I have been writing to his office for 2 months. He has agreed to a hearing if I can produce sufficient documentation." Clyde leaned forward slightly. "Mrs. Reed, your father's statement would be significant. A signed, notarized affidavit from one of Voss's victims, corroborating the pattern, the false documents, the timing. It would be the piece that makes the others irrefutable rather than merely suggestive." Sallie sat with that for a moment. 3 weeks was a long time to stay in a place she had arrived at with the intention of leaving quickly. She had borrowed a horse. She had $11 in her bag. "I will need somewhere to stay," she said, "and I do not have money for a hotel." Clyde Whitaker did not hesitate, but neither did he speak immediately. The pause told her he was thinking seriously about the practical logistics rather than making a careless offer. "There is a boarding house run by a woman named Clara Hatch," he said. "She charges $2 a week. I can speak for the first week, and after that there is work available at the dry goods store on Main Street. The owner's wife broke her wrist last month, and they need someone to help with the counter." Sallie looked at him for a long moment. She was trying to find the trap. She was trained by recent experience to find the trap in everything. But what she found instead was a man who was managing a grief of his own, who had been alone with it for 6 months, and who had just offered practical assistance with the careful, non-presumptuous courtesy of someone who understood what it was to need help and not want to be pitied for it. "All right," she said. I will stay. Clara Hatch was a compact woman of 55 with iron-gray hair and an expression of permanent mild skepticism that Sallie found deeply reassuring. She showed Sallie a room on the second floor with a window that looked out over the main street, a bed with a proper mattress, a washstand, and a hook on the back of the door. It was clean and modest, and Sallie sat on the edge of the bed that first night and allowed herself to cry for approximately 4 minutes, which was 4 minutes more than she had permitted herself since Thomas died. Then she washed her face, unpacked her bag with the economical movements of someone who intended to be organized about their grief, and went asleep. She woke early, as she always did. The town of Dustcreek in the summer of 1878 was a population of perhaps 800 people, a county seat for a district that ran 20 miles in every direction across flat, hot Texas scrubland. There was a main street with a bank, a dry goods store, a barber shop, a doctor's office, a church, a telegraph office, a livery stable, and the Silver Spur Saloon. There were side streets with houses, some wooden, some adobe, a small schoolhouse on the eastern edge of town, and a water tower that creaked in the wind. She found the dry goods store before 8 in the morning and spoke to the owner, a man named August Pelham, who had a red beard and the wary expression of a man who had been disappointed before, but was willing to be cautiously optimistic. His wife, a soft-spoken woman named Dottie, was sitting in the back with her wrist in a splint, doing her best to manage the ledger one-handed and failing. Sallie had been managing a farm's account since she was 16. She offered her services for $3 a week, which was $1 more than Pelham was inclined to pay, and she laid out her qualifications with the matter-of-fact confidence of someone who knew exactly what she was worth. They settled on $2.75. She started the next morning. The days began to have a shape. Mornings she worked at the dry goods store, managing the counter, the accounts, and the ordering of supplies. Afternoons she spent at Clara Hatch's kitchen table, writing the formal affidavit of her father's case in careful, clear language, with Clyde Whitaker across from her sometimes, providing information about the legal terminology and the specific documentary evidence he had gathered. Those afternoons were the beginning of something she did not have a name for yet. Clyde Whitaker was 31 years old, which she learned not because he told her, but because Clara Hatch mentioned it in the forthright way that Clara Hatch mentioned most things, while pouring coffee and expressing no particular judgment about the information she was conveying. He had grown up in the Texas Panhandle, the son of a cattle rancher, and had spent his 20s working the operation with his father after his mother's death from cholera in 1869. He had been engaged once, to a woman named Frances, but Frances had gone east to live with a relative in St. Louis in 1875, and the engagement had dissolved by letter with no particular drama and apparently no great damage to either party. He had no siblings. He owned nothing currently, having sold what remained of the cattle operation to cover his father's burial expenses and fund his 6-month investigation into Harlan Voss. He was staying in the room next to the one Sallie now occupied at Clara Hatch's boarding house. He was, she would later think, the kind of person who occupied space thoughtfully. He did not fill a room with unnecessary noise. He listened when she spoke, and she noticed that he remembered details, small ones, the way she took her coffee, the name of the neighbor who had lent her the horse, the fact that her father preferred sorghum to wheat because sorghum asked less of the soil. She noticed this because Thomas had been a good listener too, and she had learned to value it. On the 5th day, he walked her out to the edge of town in the evening when the heat had begun to soften and the sky was going amber and pink in the west, and they stood at the fence line where the main street ended and the flat scrubland began, and he said without looking at her, "What was he like? Your husband?" She was quiet for a moment. The question surprised her not because it was intrusive but because it was kind, and she was still recalibrating to kindness. "Steady," she said finally. "He was very steady. You always knew where you stood with Thomas. He was not romantic in the dramatic sense. He never wrote poetry or made speeches, but he was consistent. He showed up. Every day he showed up. She paused. When you are young, you think that is not enough. Then you get older and you understand that showing up every day is actually everything. Clyde nodded slowly. The evening light caught the side of his face, and she looked at him for a moment with the objective clarity that grief sometimes produces, seeing him as simply a man who was standing beside her in the failing light, not looking at her, respecting the space around what she had just said. "He sounds like a man worth grieving," Clyde said. "He was," she said. They stood there a little longer, watching the stars begin to establish themselves in the darkening sky, and neither of them said anything else, and somehow that was enough. On the 8th day, a complication arrived. His name was Deke Rourke, and he was a man who worked for Harlan Voss. Sallie was behind the counter at the dry goods store when Rourke came in. She did not know who he was immediately. He was a broad-shouldered man in his 40s, with a scar that bisected his left eyebrow, and a way of moving that suggested he was assessing everything in any room he entered. He bought tobacco and twine and did not engage in conversation, but as he was leaving he paused at the door and looked back at her with the particular unhurried attention of a man committing a face to memory. She told Clyde that evening. He went very still in the way that she was beginning to recognize as his response to information that required immediate recalibration. "That is Deke Rourke," he said. "He does not live in Dustcreek. He should not be here for 3 more weeks when Voss returns." "He was watching me," she said. Clyde stood up from the table and walked to the window, looking out at the dark street below. "Someone told Voss you were here," he said. "Voss sent Rourke to take a look." He turned from the window. "You need to be careful. Rourke has never hurt a woman that I know of, but Voss does not have that constraint." Sallie felt a cold awareness travel through her, not fear exactly, but the heightened alertness of someone who has understood that the stakes have just been recalibrated. "He cannot afford for us to get those affidavits to Judge Hinds," she said. "No," Clyde said. "He cannot." He was quiet for a moment. "The affidavit you are writing. Is it finished?" "Almost. Another day. Finish it tomorrow. I want to send it to the bank in Amarillo with the others before Rourke decides to do more than look." She nodded. She was aware that the room had shifted in some indefinable way, that the distance she had been managing between herself and Clyde Whitaker had shortened, not because either of them had chosen it, but because external pressure had a way of doing that. When you are standing on narrowing ground, you move closer to the person standing on it with you. The next morning she was at the dry goods store before it opened, writing the final portion of the affidavit at the back counter by lamplight before August Pelham arrived, and she finished it in 2 hours with the precise, focused determination of someone who has found a task worth doing. She blotted and folded it and gave it to Clyde at noon, and he rode out to Amarillo that same afternoon with the document inside his coat. He was gone for 2 days. She did not examine how long the 2 days felt. She kept working. She helped Dottie Pelham address a backlog of supply orders and reorganize the store's accounts into a system that made structural sense. And she ate dinner with Clara Hatch in the evenings and listened to Clara talk about the town's history with the comfortable authority of a woman who had been watching it unfold for 30 years. Clara had come to Dustcreek in 1848 with her first husband, who had died of snakebite in 1851. She had run the boarding house since 1852, first on her own and then with her second husband, Jerome Hatch, who had died of a stroke in 1869. She had loved both men, she said, in entirely different ways, and she had no patience for the sentiment that a person only got one true attachment in a lifetime. "The heart is not a water glass," she said, setting a slice of dried apple pie in front of Sallie on the second evening of Clyde's absence. "It does not run out. It expands. That is what grief teaches you if you let it teach you something useful." Sallie ate her pie and said nothing, but she thought about it. Clyde returned on the evening of the second day with the papers safely deposited and a new, composed energy that told her the plan had moved forward. He sat down across from her at the kitchen table and laid out the updated situation with the methodical clarity she had come to rely on. The affidavits, including hers, were secured in Amarillo. He had sent a letter to Judge Hind's office in Fort Worth confirming the documentation was complete. The judge was scheduled to arrive in Dustcreek in 18 days. Voss was due back from Laredo in 20. "There is a 2-day window," Clyde said. "If we can get Voss in front of the judge before he has time to organize his legal response, the affidavits give us a strong position. His partner in the records office has already signed the Prescott affidavit, so the documentary chain is corroborated from both ends." "And if Voss moves faster than expected?" Sallie asked. "Then we adjust," Clyde said. He met her eyes across the table. "I want you to know that I do not consider you responsible for the danger you may be in because of Rourke's presence. That was not in the agreement when you decided to stay." "I decided to stay because I chose to," she said. "I am still choosing to. I am not a person who requires permission to assess my own risk." Something shifted in his expression, something quiet and warm, and he looked down at his hands for a moment before looking back up. "No," he said, "I did not think you were." He paused. "I just wanted to say it, in case it needed to be said." The evening had softened around them. The lamp on the table between them threw a circle of yellow light. Clara Hatch had gone to bed an hour ago, and the house was quiet. And outside the one window the stars were doing what stars do in the Texas summer, which is occupy the sky with a casual magnificence that makes everything below them seem temporarily irrelevant. Sallie became aware in that moment that she was looking at Clyde Whitaker's hands again, the calluses, the careful way they rested on the table. She pulled her attention back to the practical matter. 18 days, she said. 18 days, he agreed. The 18 days became something she had not expected them to become. They were not romantic days precisely, or not entirely. They were working days, careful and purposeful, full of the kinds of conversations that happen when two people with similar temperaments and parallel griefs are engaged in a shared undertaking. But underneath the practical work, something else was happening, and Sallie felt it the way you feel a change in weather, not in a single moment but in the accumulation of small signals. He brought her coffee in the morning without being asked. She noticed when he was troubled and asked about it directly, and he told her, which was something she suspected he did not do often. They disagreed about the order in which to present the affidavits to Judge Hinds, and the disagreement lasted 3 days, conducted with a respectful but genuine intensity that neither of them was willing to abandon until they had each fully examined the other's reasoning. She was right. He acknowledged it with the unambiguous directness she was coming to appreciate, and revised the presentation strategy accordingly. She wrote a letter to her father, telling him that she had found a path toward reclaiming what had been taken, not promising it, but describing the real and documentable progress she had made. Henry Caldwell wrote back within 10 days, a letter that arrived slightly crumpled and smelling faintly of his tobacco, and she read it sitting on the back steps of Clara Hatch's boarding house in the early morning and felt him in it, his careful handwriting, his formal phrasing that could not quite contain his emotion, his final line. "I am proud of you, Sallie girl, your mother would have been too." She folded the letter and held it in her hands and stared at the flat horizon for a long time. She heard boots on the steps behind her, and did not need to turn to know who it was. Clyde sat down on the step below hers, which put him slightly lower and to the side, and he said nothing because he had learned, she thought, the exact moments when nothing was the right thing to say. She appreciated that more than she could have articulated. After a while she said, "My mother died when I was 12. "How?" he asked, not intrusively, just asking because she had opened the door. "Childbirth," she said. "The baby too, a boy. My father never really talked about it, but I think part of him never fully came back from that year. I think that is part of why he is so vulnerable to the particular kind of man that Voss is." When you are carrying that much unspoken grief, you become careless sometimes. Yes, Clyde said quietly. My father was the same after my mother died, careful about the cattle, careless about himself. She turned her head and looked at him, and he was looking at the same horizon she had been looking at, and the morning light was doing something interesting with the angle of his face, and she thought for the first time, with a kind of startled clarity, that he was a person she would have sought out even in a world where Harlan Voss had never existed. That was the morning she understood that something had already happened, and that she was the last one to notice it. 13 days before Judge Hinz was due to arrive, Deke Rourke came back. This time he was not buying tobacco. Clyde was at the telegraph office when it happened, sending a confirmation to the bank in Amarillo. Sallie was alone in the dry goods store. It was midday and August Pelham had stepped out to the barber shop, and Rourke came in with a second man she had not seen before, a thin man with a mustache and the kind of eyes that do not quite land on you directly, and Rourke leaned on the counter and looked at her with the unhurried assessment she remembered from before. "You are Henry Caldwell's daughter," he said. Not a question. Sallie's hands were below the counter. She was quietly calculating the distance to the revolver she kept in the cabinet behind her. "I do not know what you are referring to," she said. "Mr. Voss knows you are here," Rourke said. "He wanted me to pass along that the paperwork you have been putting together, whatever it is you think you are doing, is not going to change the legal situation. The documents are valid. The claim is registered. A widow from Kansas riding into Dustcreek with a grudge is not going to overturn a legally filed encumbrance." He paused. "He also wanted me to say that if you are sensible about this, there is no reason for the next 3 weeks to be unpleasant." "That sounds like a threat," Sallie said. "It is a clarification," Rourke said. "Tell Mr. Voss," Sallie said, keeping her voice level, "that I appreciate his concern and I will take it under careful consideration." Rourke looked at her for a moment longer, then straightened up and walked out. The thin man followed. The bell above the door jangled behind them. Sallie stood very still for approximately 10 seconds. Then she walked to the telegraph office as quickly as she could without running. Clyde read the situation in her face before she had said a word. He paid for his telegram and stepped outside with her, and she told him what had happened concisely and in order, and he listened with his full attention and then said, "He knows about the affidavits." "Yes," he said. "Paperwork." He knew to say paperwork. Clyde's jaw was set. "Someone talked, not Prescott. He has too much to lose. Someone in the network knew you were building a case." He thought for a moment. "It does not change the timeline. The documents are in Amarillo. Voss cannot touch them there without exposing himself, and Hinz arrives in 13 days. Rourke will come back," Sallie said. "Yes," Clyde said. "He will." He looked at her directly. "Can you stay at the store with Pelham present for the rest of the week? Not alone." "I can arrange that," she said. "August is not fearless, but he is decent, and he will not leave if I ask him not to." Clyde nodded. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said something she had not expected. "I am sorry you are in this position. I brought you into this in a way by asking you to stay." "You gave me a choice," she said. "I made it. Do not apologize for my choices." He looked at her with an expression she could not entirely decipher, something layered and careful, and then he said very quietly, "All right." They walked back to the boarding house together in the afternoon heat, and their arms were close enough that twice their hands almost touched, and she was aware of it both times in a way that had nothing to do with Harlan Voss. The days between Rourke's visit and Judge Hintz's arrival were taut as a wire. Rourke did not return immediately, which was almost worse than if he had. The absence of direct threat created a constant low vibration of alertness that Sallie found more exhausting than confrontation. She managed it by working. She reorganized Pelham's entire supply ordering system. She wrote 2 more letters to her father, detailed and careful. She helped Dottie Pelham with a difficult inventory. She read in the evenings from the small collection of books Clara Hatch kept on the shelf in the sitting room, a well-thumbed Bible, a copy of David Copperfield that had lost its cover somewhere, a collection of poetry by a man named Longfellow. She found Clyde one evening sitting in the sitting room with the Longfellow, which surprised her. "Do you read poetry?" she asked. "My mother did," he said. "She used to read to us in the evenings. I read it sometimes, because it sounds like her voice in my head when I do." He paused, apparently registering how much he had just said, and looked at her with a slightly self-conscious expression that she found unexpectedly charming on a man who was generally so composed. "That is a beautiful thing," she said simply. "Do not tell anyone in the saloon," he said. She laughed. It was the first time she had laughed in months, a real laugh, not the polite social approximation of one but the involuntary, unguarded kind, and it startled both of them. She put her hand over her mouth, and he watched her with an expression of such unguarded warmth that she felt it in her chest like a struck chord. She sat down in the chair across from him and said, "Read me something." He found a page and he read without self-consciousness once he had started, his voice even and quiet in the lamplit room, and she sat with her hands in her lap and listened, not entirely to the words but to the voice, to the quality of care in it. When he finished, the room was very quiet. She was aware that she was in danger of a different kind entirely. "Clyde," she said, and then stopped, because she did not know what she had meant to say. He looked at her and waited, giving her space to find it or not find it. "I want to tell you something," she said finally. "And I want you to know that I am not saying it because of the situation we are in or because I am frightened or because I am grateful for what you are doing. I am saying it because I think it is true and I think you should know it." "All right," he said. "I think you are a good man," she said. "I have not met very many of them. I mean that specifically. I mean that the way you operate, the care you take with things, the way you think about what is right before you act, the way you remember things that matter, those are qualities I recognize and value, and I wanted to say it plainly." He was very still for a moment. "Sallie," he said, and the way he said her name was different from the way anyone had said it in a very long time. Not Thomas's way, which had been warm and familiar, something newer, something with more weight in it, more careful attention. "I have been trying," he said slowly, "to be respectful of where you are, what you are going through, what you came here carrying." "I know," she said. "But I should tell you," he said, "that sitting across from you at this table for the past 2 weeks has been the least alone I have felt since my father died." He paused. "That is not nothing." "No," she said, "it is not." They sat with that for a while, not moving toward each other, not moving away, simply allowing the truth of the moment to exist in the room. It was enough. It was, in fact, rather a lot. Outside, the Texas summer night was enormous and full of stars. 10 days later, on a Tuesday morning in August of 1878, a buckboard carriage came up Main Street with the federal seal on its side panel, and Judge Albert Hinds stepped out in front of the Dustcreek courthouse in a gray coat and a hat that had seen better decades, and Dustcreek held its breath. Clyde had spent the previous 3 days in meticulous preparation. He had written a presentation brief, organized the affidavits in chronological order of the incidents they described, annotated the documentary evidence from the county records with specific citation to the falsified filing dates, and prepared a clear narrative of the scheme that a judge who had never heard of Harlan Voss could follow from beginning to end without needing to ask clarifying questions. Sallie had read every version of it, found 3 structural improvements, and argued successfully for the placement of the Prescott affidavit as the opening document rather than the closing one, on the grounds that establishing the insider corroboration first made every subsequent victim's account more credible rather than less. Judge Hinds had agreed to a preliminary hearing on Wednesday, 3 days before Voss was expected to return. There had been a tense conversation that Clyde had relayed to Sallie, in which the judge's clerk had suggested that Voss might wish to have legal representation present before any formal proceedings began, and Clyde had pointed out with restrained but pointed precision that the existence of a federal investigation into Voss's activities was not public knowledge, had not been telegraphed, and that informing Voss in advance would constitute a material compromise of the proceeding. The clerk had not pushed back further. Sallie dressed carefully on Wednesday morning. She did not wear her morning black. She had purchased, 3 days earlier with 2 weeks of her saved wages, a dress in a dark blue wool that was appropriate to the gravity of the occasion without communicating defeat. Clara Hatch had pressed it for her the night before, silently, with the thoroughness of a woman who understood the importance of details. Clyde was waiting for her at the foot of the stairs. He was wearing his best coat, which was dark and clean, and he had his hat in his hands and his hair was brushed back neatly, and he looked at her coming down the stairs with an expression that was composed in the way that a face is composed when the person wearing it has made a quiet decision about something. "You look," he said, and stopped. "Ready?" she supplied. "Yes," he said, "and also more than that, but the courthouse is waiting." She felt warmth move up through her chest and she kept her face arranged carefully. "Let us go," she said. The hearing lasted 3 hours. Judge Albert Hinz was a man who did not waste time on theater. He read each document in silence, asked incisive questions in the flat professional tone of a man who had seen every variant of human dishonesty and was not surprised by any of them, and listened to Clyde's presentation with the focused attention of someone who is building a structure in his mind as the materials are handed to him. Sallie sat beside Clyde at the petitioner's table and answered the judge's direct questions about her father's case clearly and without embellishment. She described the timeline, the document her father had signed, the subsequent filing, the notice of encumbrance, the farm's current status, and the impact on her father's health, not as a grievance but as a sequence of verifiable facts, which was, she believed, what the moment required. When Hinz set down the final document and looked at them across the table, his expression was still professionally neutral, but there was something behind it that she read as the satisfaction of a man who has been given a complete argument. "The pattern here is clear and the documentation is extensive," Hinz said. "The Prescott affidavit, combined with the county record's discrepancies you have identified, establishes probable cause for federal fraud charges. I am issuing a warrant for Harlan Voss's arrest to be executed upon his return to Dustcreek, which I understand to be in 3 days. I am also issuing orders to the relevant county records offices to freeze any outstanding encumbrances filed under the names appearing in these affidavits pending full review." Sallie heard the words and felt them settle into her with a complicated emotion that was part relief and part something older and more tired than relief. "With regard to the specific properties," Hinz continued, "a formal review process will be required and I cannot guarantee the outcome, but the strength of this documentation puts the burden of proof firmly on the side of the original claimant. In plain terms, if the encumbrances are found to be fraudulently filed, which this evidence strongly suggests, the affected properties will revert to their prior holders." He stood up. "Mr. Whitaker, Mrs. Reed, this is thorough, careful work. I want you to know that. It is not easy to build a case like this without the resources of a prosecutorial office behind you." He paused. "Your fathers should know that their children did not let them down." Sallie's eyes stung. She kept her composure until they were outside in the bright August morning, and then she stopped walking and stood very still with her face tilted up slightly, breathing the hot, dry air, and Clyde stood beside her and did not say anything. And after a moment she felt his hand, very carefully, cover hers where it hung at her side. She turned her hand over and held his. They stood there on the street in front of the Dustcreek courthouse in the summer heat, holding hands in the plain sunlight, and neither of them needed to name what it was. Harlan Voss arrived in Dustcreek on Friday afternoon. He rode in on a fine bay horse, dressed expensively, broad-shouldered and confident, with the manner of a man who had never once been confronted with the material consequence of his own actions. He was perhaps 50, with a florid face and gray-threaded hair, and the particular bearing of someone who has mistaken good luck for natural superiority for so long that the distinction no longer exists for them. Sheriff Dale Coombs, who had initially been resistant to the proceedings but who Judge Hinds had brought firmly into line on Wednesday evening, met Voss at the edge of Main Street with 2 deputies and the federal warrant. Voss's composure cracked for approximately 3 seconds when the warrant was presented, and in those 3 seconds Sallie, watching from the doorway of the dry goods store, saw the real man behind the manufactured confidence, and he was smaller than she had imagined. Not physically. He was exactly as large as he had appeared from a distance. But when the warrant was in his hand and the reality of his situation was registering in his face, the specific quality of smallness that lives inside people who cause harm without consequence when consequence finally arrives, that quality showed itself clearly. She felt no particular triumph. She felt the clean absence of the weight she had been carrying since April. That was enough. The formal proceedings before Judge Hinds took place over the following 2 days. Voss had a lawyer who rode down from Amarillo on short notice and did what he could, which was limited by the strength of the documentation against his client. The Prescott affidavit, when read into the record, produced a silence in the courtroom that lasted longer than normal silences. The county record's discrepancies, laid out in Clyde's careful annotation, were not arguable in any meaningful way. Voss attempted to characterize the proceedings as a vendetta by disgruntled gamblers who had made their own poor choices, and Judge Hinds allowed him to make this argument in full before disposing of it in 4 sentences. The verdict of the preliminary proceeding was a federal indictment on 7 counts of fraud. The civil process of restoring the affected properties would take several more months and would involve county courts in 3 jurisdictions. But the federal indictment invalidated all outstanding encumbrances filed under Voss's scheme, and the Caldwell farm was listed among the affected properties. Sallie sent a telegram to her father in Wichita that evening from the telegraph office on Main Street. She wrote it 3 times on the scrap paper the telegraph operator provided before she had it in a form that said what she meant in 12 words. "Papa, come home. The farm is yours again. I love you." She handed it to the operator and paid for it and walked out onto the front step of the office, and the evening air was coming in cooler than usual, which was unusual for August in Texas and felt like a gift. And Clyde was leaning against the wall beside the door with his hat pushed back and his arms crossed. And when she came out, he looked at her and she looked at him. And there was a moment of complete understanding between them that had no need of words at all. And then she walked the 2 steps between them, and he took his arms uncrossed and put them around her. And she put her face against the front of his coat and felt the warmth and solidity of him and allowed herself, for the first time in months, to feel the full weight of everything she had carried and to put it down. He held her with the careful, real attention of a man who understood that being held was something a person should experience without conditions or reservations. After a while she lifted her head and looked up at him and said, "What do we do now?" He looked at her with those gray eyes, calm and direct and full of something she no longer needed to be cautious about identifying. "What would you like to do?" he asked. "I would like," she said, "to have dinner without thinking about Harlan Voss for the first time in 3 months. That," he said, "is a very achievable ambition." They had dinner at the one restaurant in Dustcreek, a small establishment next to the barbershop run by a Mexican family named Reyes who had been in the area since before the town had a name, and who made a beef stew with dried chilies that was the best thing Sallie had eaten in longer than she could remember. They sat at a table by the window and talked, not about Voss, not about the case, not about the farm or the affidavits or the judge. They talked about other things, the books they had read, the landscape of Kansas versus the landscape of Texas, the specific quality of silence in different kinds of country, what they had wanted to be as children before the wanting got disciplined into practicality. He had wanted to be a cartographer. She had wanted to breed horses. Neither of them had become those things, and neither was particularly rueful about it, but she liked knowing it. She told him about Thomas. Not with grief, exactly, but with the warmth of accurate memory. She told him about the letters they had written, about the first time Thomas had come to the farm and helped her father repair a fence, and how her father had liked him immediately, and about the way Thomas had looked at the prairie with a quiet appreciation she had always found moving. Clyde listened with his full attention and asked questions that showed he understood what she was giving him, the specific gift of sharing a love that had already ended with someone new. He told her about his father. The 30 years of building something real from flat land and determination. The evenings on the porch. The way his father had talked about the cattle as though they were individuals, which they were, each one known and tracked. The way he had died in January, quietly in his sleep, which was better than the dying he had feared but worse than the dying he had deserved, because what he had deserved was to die in his own bed in the house he had built, not in a borrowed room in a borrowed town. Sallie put her hand across the table and covered his, and he looked down at her hand and then up at her face, and she thought that this specific moment, the warm restaurant and the small candle between them and the man across the table with his grief and his goodness and his limestone-gray eyes, was something she had not known she was moving toward until she was already there. They walked back to the boarding house in the soft evening air, and at the door she turned to him, and he looked at her with a question in his expression that was respectful and honest and completely without pressure, and she said, "I am not ready yet to be rushed into anything. But I want you to know that I am not standing still either." "I know," he said. "I am not going anywhere." "You might have to go somewhere," she said. "You do not have land here. You do not have anything specifically tying you to Dustcreek." "I have something tying me to Dustcreek," he said, and he said it simply, without dramatization, and it landed exactly as he had meant it to. She looked at him for a long moment, and then she stood up slightly on her toes and kissed him, briefly and warmly, not a beginning and not a promise, but an acknowledgement of where they already were. He was very still for a moment after, and then he smiled, which transformed his face in a way she had not seen before and which she immediately wanted to see again. "Good night," she said. "Good night, Sallie Reed," he said. She went inside and up the stairs and into her room with the window that looked over the main street, and she lay on the bed and looked at the ceiling and felt, for the first time in a very long time, like a person with a future. August became September. Henry Caldwell arrived in Dustcreek on the 15th of September, having taken the stage from Wichita to Amarillo, and hired a buckboard for the rest of the distance, a journey that had cost him money he did not have, and that he had arranged by borrowing from the cousin he was staying with, and from the proceeds of selling his pocket watch, which was the only thing of material value he still owned. He arrived at Clara Hatch's boarding house in the late afternoon with a travel bag and a face that showed all 61 years of him, and then some, and Sallie met him on the front steps and embraced him, and she felt him shake slightly in her arms, not from cold, but from the particular release of a man who has been carrying more than he can manage and has finally found someone to set it down with. She introduced him to Clyde that evening at dinner. Henry Caldwell was a quiet, careful observer of men, a quality that had been temporarily overwhelmed by the grief and shame of the past year, but that was, she knew, still very much present underneath it. He watched Clyde with the assessing attention of a father whose daughter has ridden 240 miles alone into a hostile situation and come out of it with a man he had not known existed 3 months ago. Clyde met this assessment without defensiveness, spoke to Henry directly and respectfully, asked him specific questions about the farm, about the sorghum operation, about the land management techniques Henry had developed over 20 years, and Henry, who could not resist a genuine question about farming any more than he could resist breathing, began to answer, and gradually his shoulders came down from around his ears, and the conversation became something natural. After dinner, when Sallie was helping Clara clear the dishes, She heard Clyde and her father on the front porch, talking in the low, even way that men talk when they are finding each other's measure, and she stopped for a moment with a dish in her hands and listened to the sound of it and felt something settle into place in her chest. Clara came up beside her and said nothing, just followed the direction of Sally's attention toward the sound of the voices on the porch, and then went back to the dishes with the expression of a woman who has seen enough of life to know when something is going right and who has the good sense to let it. The civil process took 4 more months. The county courts in the 3 affected jurisdictions had to individually review and overturn the fraudulent filings, and this required correspondence, appearances, and the patient management of bureaucratic timelines that tried even Sally's considerable organizational patience. Clyde handled much of it, riding between Dustcreek and Amarillo, and on one occasion, all the way to Wichita for a Kansas court appearance on behalf of the affected landowners in that jurisdiction. Henry Caldwell's farm was formally restored to his name on the 2nd of November, 1878, which was a cold, gray day in Kansas that Sally experienced by telegram, reading the words at the Dustcreek telegraph office and going outside and standing in the November wind for a long time with the paper in her hand. When Clyde returned from Wichita, where he had been present at the Kansas proceeding, he came back with dust on his coat and the light in his eyes that she had learned to read as satisfaction at something done right. And he told her it was over, and she told him she knew, and they sat together on the bench outside Clara Hatch's boarding house in the November afternoon, and she put her head against his shoulder, and he put his arm around her, and they stayed like that until the light went. Harlan Voss was convicted on federal fraud charges in December of 1878 and sentenced to 8 years in a federal penitentiary. Deke Rourke, whose involvement was more limited, received 18 months. Prescott, the records clerk, received a reduced sentence of 2 years in exchange for his testimony. All of this was reported in the Amarillo Daily News, a copy of which found its way to Dustcreek, and which Sally read with Clara Hatch over coffee, both of them quiet with their own versions of the same feeling. On a Sunday evening in December, with a light cold rain coming down outside and the sitting room of Clara Hatch's boarding house warm from the stove, Clyde sat down beside Sally on the settee and took her hand and held it for a moment and then said without preamble, "I want to ask you something. You do not have to answer immediately. You can take time." "I generally prefer to answer things immediately," she said. "I know," he said. "I have learned that about you." He paused. "I have been thinking about what comes next. I have a small amount of capital from the sale of the Texas Panhandle operation. Not much, but enough for a start. And I have been looking at land, specifically at some range land about 12 miles north of here that has a creek and reasonable grass and the potential to run cattle again. I wanted to know," he said, and his voice was steady, but she could feel the care in it, the weight of what he was about to say, "whether you would consider building something like that with me. Not to replace what you have lost. Not as a solution to a practical problem, but because I think we are the kind of people who build things well when they work together, and because I have not wanted to stop sitting across from you since the second day we sat across from each other in that saloon." Sally looked at him for a long time, the rain on the window, the stove's warmth. His hands holding hers with the steadiness she had identified the first night, the real quality of him, the carpenter in his character, the man who built things carefully and knew the value of foundations. "I have a condition," she said. "Name it," he said. "My father," she said. "He is 61 and he has no farm and he has too much pride to live on other people's charity for the rest of his life. If we build something, there is a place in it for him, not charity, contribution. He knows land and he knows farming and he is worth the room." Clyde did not hesitate. "He is already planning to move to Kansas next spring," he said, and she blinked. "You talked to him about this," she said. "I asked him," Clyde said carefully, "whether he might be interested in ranch work if such an opportunity arose, hypothetically. He said he would rather die in a field than die in a borrowed room, and that sorghum was not the only thing he knew how to grow. He paused. "I should have told you I spoke to him first. I did not want to presume." She laughed, the unguarded kind again. "You are remarkable," she said. "Is that a yes?" he asked. "Clyde Whitaker," she said. "That is an emphatic and wholehearted yes." He lifted her hand and pressed his lips to the back of it, formally and gently. And when he looked up at her, his gray eyes had that warmth in them she had first noticed on the second or third evening and had been cataloging quietly ever since. And she thought, with the particular clarity of a moment that knows what it is, that this was what it felt like to choose a person with your whole self rather than your circumstances. They were married in March of 1879 in the Dustcreek church, which was a small white-painted building with wooden pews and a minister named Reverend Douglas, who had presided over more funerals than weddings in recent years, and was visibly delighted by the change. Clara Hatch sat in the front pew with a handkerchief she had not expected to need. Henry Caldwell stood beside his daughter with the recovered bearing of a man who has been given back something he thought was lost forever, and when Reverend Douglas asked who gave this woman in marriage, Henry said, with a steadiness that cost him something and was worth it, "I do, with all my heart." August and Dottie Pelham were there. The Ray's family from the restaurant were there. The banker from Amarillo had come down for the occasion, and several of the other victims of Voss's scheme who had become part of Clyde and Sally's correspondence over the preceding months sent letters that Sally read the night before the wedding and kept in a box. Clyde was waiting at the front of the church, and when he turned and saw her come through the door, the expression on his face was one that Sally knew she would carry for the rest of her life, not because it was dramatic or theatrical, but because it was so completely unguarded, such a simple, clean expression of a man who has found the thing he did not know he was looking for. They said the words that words like that require, and they were married, and then they walked out of the church together into the March sunshine, which was warm and generous, and doing its best, and Clara Hatch wept behind her handkerchief, and Henry Caldwell stood on the church step with his hands in his pockets, and looked at the sky with the expression of a man who is speaking internally to people who are not there anymore. The land 12 miles north of Dustcreek was purchased in April, just as the spring grass was coming in. It was 160 acres of gently rolling scrubland with a reliable creek running along the eastern border, and a stand of cottonwood trees that provided enough shade to matter. There was a small house on it, 2 rooms and a lean-to kitchen, barely habitable, which Clyde immediately began to make more than barely habitable with the systematic determination of a man who has been waiting for something to build. Henry Caldwell arrived from Kansas in late April, riding the stage to Amarillo and then the buckboard the rest of the way, with his tools in a trunk and the look of a man reporting for a duty he had assigned himself. He and Clyde spent the first 3 weeks repairing and expanding the house, putting in a proper kitchen and a second bedroom, fixing the fence lines, and assessing the creek for water management. Henry, who had never worked cattle but who knew land and irrigation and the patience that growing things requires, turned out to have a complementary skill set to Clyde's ranching knowledge that neither of them had anticipated, and Sally watched them work together from the kitchen window with a feeling she had no precise name for, something in the neighborhood of abundance. She was pregnant by May, which she had suspected for 3 weeks before she told Clyde, and she told him on a Tuesday evening after dinner when they were sitting on the front porch they had just finished building, and his face went through several expressions rapidly before settling on one of such transparent and complete joy that she laughed, and then he laughed, and then he put his arms around her and held her very carefully, as though she had become suddenly more fragile, and she said, "I am not made of glass." "Clyde," and he said, I know," 3 times and held her closer. She wrote to Clara Hatch, who responded with a letter of 8 pages containing every piece of practical advice she had accumulated in 55 years of living, most of it sound and some of it unintentionally funny, and which Sallie kept in the same box as the wedding letters. The summer of 1879 was hot and productive. The first cattle, a small herd of 30 head that Clyde purchased from a rancher 40 miles east, arrived in June, and the ranch began to operate in the elementary but real way that all things begin, with more work than expected and more satisfaction than anticipated. Henry managed the kitchen garden with an intensity that produced more vegetables than 3 people could eat, which he resolved by beginning to sell the surplus to a family down the road, and this exchange became something larger over time, a kind of informal commerce that gave Henry a purpose and a dignity that the preceding year had almost taken permanently from him. In December of 1879, Sallie delivered a boy. She named him Henry Thomas Whitaker. Henry for her father and Thomas for her first husband, both of which she had discussed with Clyde in the careful, honest way they discussed everything. And Clyde had said, without hesitation, that both names were good and right, and that a man who had loved her deserved to be remembered, and she had held his face in her hands and looked at him for a long moment and said nothing, because some forms of gratitude are too large for words. Henry Thomas came into the world in December with a great deal of noise and opinion, which Clara Hatch, who had made the journey from Dustcreek to be present, said was a very good sign in any person. He had his father's gray eyes and his mother's dark hair, and from approximately the first week of his life, he appeared to regard the world with the same alert, assessing attention that both his parents brought to everything, which his grandfather found hilarious and entirely appropriate. Henry Caldwell, who had been a quiet man in his last few years, discovered that he was not a quiet grandfather. He was, in fact, a voluble and enthusiastic one, and the sight of him in the spring of 1880, walking around the kitchen garden with the baby on his arm, narrating the growth of the tomato plants in the solemn instructional tone of someone conveying important information, was something Sallie treasured with a completeness that made the preceding year's suffering feel, if not worthwhile exactly, then at least not wasted. The ranch grew. Clyde added cattle carefully, never faster than the land and the creek could support, always with the patient long-term thinking that had characterized his work on his father's operation, and that he brought to everything. And by the summer of 1880, they had 80 head on 160 acres that were being managed with a combination of Clyde's ranching expertise and Henry's farming instinct that was producing better results than either approach would have alone. The house had grown with a third room added in the spring, because Henry Thomas took up more space than anyone had predicted, both physically and in terms of the organizational demands of a healthy and energetic infant, and because Sallie had said, in her direct way, that they might need the room for a sibling in due course. The sibling arrived in the spring of 1882, a girl this time. They named her Clara Margaret Whitaker, Clara for the woman who had given them a place to be when they had needed one, and Margaret for Clyde's mother. She arrived in April with a quiet focus that contrasted with her brother's noisy arrival, and settled into the household with the serene competence of a person who knows exactly where she is supposed to be. Henry Thomas, who was 2.5 and had opinions about everything, regarded his new sister for approximately 4 hours with deep suspicion, before apparently deciding that she was acceptable, after which he positioned himself as her primary guardian with a dedication that would become, over the years, one of the defining features of their relationship. Clara Hatch made the journey from Dustcreek again and pronounced both children and both parents in excellent condition, and the ranch itself in remarkable order for something that had been raw land 3 years earlier. The summer of 1882 was the summer that Sallie sometimes thought of afterward as the summer everything became itself. She was 31. Clyde was 35. Henry Thomas was 2.5 and beginning to form sentences with the focused efficiency of a person who has realized that language is a tool and intends to use it. Clara Margaret watched the world from her mother's arms with her grandmother's gray eyes and her grandfather's careful attention. The ranch had become something real, not wealthy but viable, not large but steady, with a reputation in the county for quality cattle, and because of Henry Caldwell's kitchen garden operation that had grown into something considerably more organized, good produce. They had hired a man named Will, a young black cowhand who had come through looking for work the previous fall, and who had proven himself so thoroughly in his first month that Clyde had offered him a permanent position, which Will had accepted with the measured relief of someone who had been looking for an honest employer for long enough to know one when he found one. The injustice of the world Will navigated every day was not something any of them could fix in its entirety, but within the borders of their ranch, they could be people who behaved with consistency and fairness, and they were. On a July evening in 1882, Sally sat on the front porch in the summer warmth with Clara Margaret asleep in the crook of her arm and Henry Thomas building something structural out of sticks in the yard, and Clyde came and sat beside her in the other chair, and they watched the sky go from blue to gold to the particular deep rose that the Texas sky saved for its best evenings. And Clyde said, without turning his head from the horizon, "Are you happy?" She thought about the question with the seriousness it deserved. She thought about the farm she had not been able to save, and the farm her father had been given back. She thought about Thomas Reed's grave in the red earth outside Abilene, which she visited every spring, which Clyde came with her to visit, and which he stood at with the respectful attention of a man who understood that love was not a fixed and limited resource. She thought about the saloon and the gun and the man leaning against the bar with his calloused hands and his direct gray eyes. She thought about the afternoons at Clara Hatch's kitchen table, the evenings on the porch, the night he had read her Longfellow in the lamplight, the morning he had held her hand on the steps outside the boarding house after a telegram and the world had cracked open into possibility. She looked at her daughter asleep in her arm, warm and certain. She looked at her son in the yard, building something out of whatever was available to him. She looked at Clyde Whitaker, who was looking at the horizon with the same quality of attention he brought to everything, the patient, careful, real attention that had been the first thing she had identified about him, and that had not varied in 4 years. "Yes," she said, "I am." He turned his head and looked at her, and she looked at him, and between them was everything they had built together and everything they had brought to the building of it, the grief and the determination and the hidden secrets they had unpacked for each other over 4 years of mornings and evenings and difficult decisions and ordinary days, and under all of it, holding all of it, the kind of love that is not dramatic every moment but is real every moment, the kind that shows up. "Good," he said, and took her hand. The sun went down over the Texas scrubland in the western direction it had always gone, and the cottonwood trees along the creek made their quiet sound in the evening wind, and Henry Thomas finished his construction project and presented it to them with the pride of someone who has made something out of nothing, which was, they both thought, a very fine thing to know how to do. The years that followed were the years of ordinary, extraordinary life. Clyde expanded the herd to 120 head by 1884 and entered into a supply agreement with a buyer in Fort Worth that provided a stable income for the first time in the ranch's existence. Henry Caldwell's garden operation had evolved by then into something he ran with Will's assistance, and that supplied 3 families on the road with fresh vegetables and dried goods, a small but dignified commerce that gave Henry what he needed, which was the feeling of being useful and the specific pleasure of watching things grow. Henry Thomas started school in Dustcreek in the fall of 1885, riding the 6 miles to town on a small bay pony that Clyde had selected and trained for him, with the thoroughness that Clyde brought to any task involving his son's safety. The boy was 7 years old by then, and had his mother's directness and his father's patience, and his grandfather's love of the land and the teachers at the Dustcreek school reported, with varying degrees of enthusiasm, that he was the most persistent questioner they had encountered in several years. Clara Margaret, at 3, was beginning to show a personality that combined her mother's precision with her grandmother Margaret's apparent love of music, because she had somehow, by the age of 3, begun to reproduce the melodies she heard in Dustcreek's church with an accuracy that startled everyone who heard her. Sallie began to think seriously about the possibility of a piano, which was a considerable expense but which Clyde, who thought of his children's potential with the same long-term investment approach he brought to the ranch, supported without reservation. In 1886, a third child arrived, another boy, whom they named James Caldwell Whitaker, after no one in particular but with a surname that was meant to carry its weight on both sides. James arrived in November with the operational efficiency of a third child, and settled into the household with a calm good humor that seemed to have been factory installed. Henry Caldwell, at 69, held his newest grandchild in the kitchen of the house he had helped build and looked at him with the expression of a man who has been given more than he expected to live to see, and said to Sallie quietly, "Your mother would have loved all of this." "I know," Sallie said. "I think she does." Henry nodded, the way he nodded when something was true and sufficient and required no additional commentary. The last letter Sallie received from Clara Hatch arrived in the spring of 1887, written in the slightly less steady hand of a woman who was 72 and beginning to feel it. Clara wrote that the boarding house was doing well under the management of her niece, who had come from San Antonio the previous year to help, and that she was sleeping better than she had in decades and eating well, and that she had heard from the Pelham family that August had finally retired and given the dry goods store to his nephew, and that Dustcreek was growing, which was both good and complicated, which was what growing always was. She ended the letter the way she ended all her letters. "I am glad you walked into the Silver Spur that night, and I am glad it went the way it did, and I am not surprised that it did, because some people are meant to find each other and the geography is just a detail." Sallie read the letter twice and then read it to Clyde that evening, and when she finished he sat quietly for a moment and then said, "She is right about the geography." Sallie smiled. "She is right about most things." "Yes," Clyde said. "She is." On a morning in the late spring of 1888, 10 years after Sallie Reed had ridden into Dustcreek with a gun in her hand and a betrayal in her heart, and walked into the Silver Spur Saloon looking for a man who had stolen everything her family had built, she stood on the front porch of the house she had helped to build and watched the sun come up over the flat Texas horizon with the steady warmth of a sun that has never needed to be anything other than what it is. Behind her in the house she could hear the sounds of the morning, James at 4 making his customary noise about breakfast, Clara Margaret at 6 already at some private occupation with a humming undertone, Henry Thomas at 8 being responsible about something in the efficient and slightly serious way that was his nature. Boots on the floorboards, the familiar weight of steps she would have known in her sleep. Clyde came to stand beside her, 2 cups of coffee in his hands, and gave her one, and she took it and wrapped both hands around it the way she had wrapped her hands around the first coffee he had ever brought her, in the back corner of a saloon 10 years ago on a Thursday evening when she had been at the end of one life and the very beginning of another. He stood beside her in the early light and they looked at what was theirs, the land, the creek, the cottonwoods, the cattle already moving at the far fence line, Will's lamp already lit in the bunkhouse, the kitchen garden in the rich green of late spring growth, the smoke beginning from the chimney. "I was thinking," Clyde said, "about expanding the north pasture. There is a section of creek land that Hanley has been considering selling. It would add about 40 acres. "It would add water rights," Sallie said. "That is the more important consideration." "Yes," he said, "it is." He looked at her sideways. "You are always more precise about this than I am." "That is why we work well together," she said. "Among other reasons," he said. She leaned her shoulder against his, and he put his arm around her, and they stood there in the early morning light with the coffee going warm in their hands, and the world opening up in front of them as it did every morning, full of the things they had made and the things they were still making, and the quiet, unassailable knowledge of what they were to each other. From inside the house, James let out a definitive announcement about the status of his breakfast requirements, and Clara Margaret told him with 3-year-old authority that patience was a virtue, which she had clearly absorbed from someone, and applied with a precision that suggested she had fully understood the concept. And Henry Thomas said something that made both younger children go briefly quiet with the particular effectiveness that only an older sibling can deploy. Sally turned her head toward the sound of them and smiled. Clyde said, "I will go make breakfast. I will be right in," she said. He kissed her temple briefly and warmly, the casual, unpremeditated affection of someone who does it because it is true and not because it is a statement, and went back inside. She stood on the porch alone for 1 more minute, holding her coffee, looking at the morning. She thought about the gun in her hand in the saloon doorway. She thought about the calculated risk of staying in a town she had arrived in looking for revenge, and the way the calculation had returned something different from what she had gone in to find. She thought about the secrets they had unpacked together over 10 years of daily life, the grief that had made them both careful and the love that had made them brave, and the way the two things had turned out not to be opposites at all but simply different expressions of the same understanding, that some things are worth protecting absolutely, and you protect them by showing up, every day, in whatever way the day requires. The sun was fully up now, pouring its uncomplicated light across the land. She turned and went inside to her family, and the door closed behind her, and the morning continued.